I was telling Lynn and Eileen earlier that and some of you will recall, one of the weeks the audio didn't work, so I had to come back and record one of our sessions since we're getting a number of people watching them. So I came back and recorded it on Sunday afternoon when nobody was in this room, and it went so well. Now, don't take that as an affront, but it's kind of interesting because you're sitting here going, like, people are sitting in front of you, and I was surprised how I didn't have any pauses or anything else like that. Obviously, I'm being tongue-in-cheek here. Don't hesitate to continue to ask questions because that's one of the best ways to learn things. Speaking of which, several people over the weekend that I saw asked me for the handouts. There are people who are watching the videos that don't have the handouts, and the more I think about it, the more I think that'd be very tough. So if you know anybody that needs the handouts, let me know. If you are watching, tpc312@hotmail.com. You can email me and I'll find some way to get them to you, because I think they're a lot handier if you got them in front of you to look at. And I'm not sure you can even see these that well on a screen. Mine I put on a big screen so I can see them. So let's pick up where we left off last week, and that's going to be in the last part of chapter 7. And you might recall that we are in kind of a pause in when we get to chapter 7, we're in kind of a pause in what's going on in the whole story. We've started with the seven sealed scroll, and we ended up with the sixth seal and cosmic changes. And then there's this gap period after chapter 6 through chapter 7. And it shifts considerably from what we've been talking about. In chapter 7, there is a pause. There's going to be another pause that you're going to see when we deal with the trumpets at exactly the same point after the sixth trumpet. And we're going to come back and talk about that as well. And then in chapter 8, we're going to begin the period of the trumpets. So the last section we're going to be in today is the last part of this kind of cosmic pause. And the thing that both of them have in common is when these pauses occur, the very next thing after them is usually something very dramatic, unlike anything else we've seen in Revelation, is usually very dramatic and announces something else. That's the purpose of the pauses. I want to deal a little bit more with that. And the question about, is Revelation sequential? Is it now, there is a difference between chronological and sequential, but in this case, I'm going to make the case that they're both the same thing, and that sequential here is that these things happen in a sequence, and the key to us in terms of determining how that sequence is going to be intensity. So I'll come back and talk about that in just a minute. But since it's a short piece, why don't we read the last part of chapter 7, which is the great multitude in white robes. You might recall last week we dealt with 144,000. We established who the 144,000 were, that they are going to be, I guess is a better way to say it. They were ethnic Jews from every tribe, and they become a world full of evangelists. So now we're going to move to the great multitude in white robes. Start with me in verse 9. After this, I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." All the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures. They fell down on their faces before the throne and worshiped God, saying, "Amen. Praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen." Then one of the elders asked me, "These in the white robes, who are they? Where do they come from?" And I answered, "Sir, you know." And he said, "These are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will spread his tent over them. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat upon them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be the shepherd, and he will lead them to springs of living water. And God will wipe every tear from their eyes. So now let's go back and talk a little bit more about this pericope. By the way, you might notice something here. Look at the very first word, the very first couple of words. After that, I looked, and there before me. What should the words after that tell us? Remember our whole discussion of what a pericope is? It's a new pericope. That's right. A pericope simply means it's a combination of two Greek words that means a cutting around. And it basically means there is a subject matter. When you were in school, you probably learned that usually a paragraph introduced a new subject matter or a couple of paragraphs. In this case, a pericope means we're going to move to a different subject. This cutting around means we're going to move to a different subject. Usually there are some key words that help us with that. After that, then, sometime later, those kinds of things usually lead you to the fact that you're going to be studying something different. We just got through talking about the 144,000. Well, now we're going to talk about this great multitude. So this is a key to us. It's a pericope that if we wanted to, we could kind of pull that section out, which is the literal meaning of pericope, to cut around or to pull out, study it and put it back. So after that is our key that we're going to be studying something different. The great multitude, in addition to praising God and the Lamb for providing salvation, will later glorify God for judging Babylon. So we're going to see him again in chapter 19. Note that we've moved from the earth in chapter 7 to before the throne in heaven, where we find this great multitude. So who are they? Who are the great multitude? Well, we're told in verse 14, these are those who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes. Now, here's my question. Since the two pericopes are placed side by side, juxtaposed, just a fancy word for being placed side by side, if we have the 144,000 in the first part of chapter 7 and now the great multitude in the last part of chapter 7, is there a logical connection here? I don't know, but I'm going to tell you, this is from the book of Tom. I'm going to tell you what I think, and that is, what are the 144,000? What's their job? To evangelize, right? So here's what I believe. I think the 144,000 evangelize the great multitude, and the great multitude are going to be those who are lost during tribulation period. In other words, who die during tribulation period. Will there be salvation during tribulation? Yes. There will be. Ernie's got the right answer, and I'm going to give you a citation for why I think that in the future. So I think, again, from the book of Tom, that there is a nexus between the two. It's 144,000 evangelists, and now the great multitude are those who died during tribulation, primarily as a result of persecution. Now, you'll notice that there's one other key for us here that I think you'll find interesting. Remember our Bible rainbow? We're about to see one of the arcs, I think, of the Bible rainbow. And I can't swear to it because someday I'm going to see if there's a way to go pull apart all the arcs of the Bible rainbow and see what leads to what, which I think would be interesting. But listen to these words. From every nation, tribe, people, and language. Now, first of all, the expressions piled on top of expression like that is a way of emphasizing something. Every nation, every tribe, every people, every language piled on top of each other is emphasis. Where else have we heard anything like that? Do you remember? Let me take you all the way back to Genesis, chapter 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make you your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse you. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. What did we just read about? Every nation, every tribe, every people, every language. I think that's bookends. I think at the beginning of Genesis, we're told, here's who the blessing is going to be on. And now we get to Revelation, and look who's being blessed. Every tribe, every people, every language, everyone. Now, the white robes, we've seen that already before. Now, they may be garments of the overcoming believers or of martyrs. And then there's one other expression here. So look at, let's see what verse we're in here. Look at verse, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God." Wearing white robes and palm branches. Palm branches, haven't we seen those recently? As in Palm Sunday? You know, the only other time the expression is used is in John's account of the triumphal entry. Palm branches were used as a praise to a incoming king or some type here. These are holding the palm branches. The martyrs are holding the palm branches dressed in white robes. So the intensifying scene of worship continues in this heavenly throne room in verses 11 and 12 with the added element of thanksgiving. So here we get that those praising are also saying in thanksgiving for their salvation, the salvation of the great multitude. Then we get to this very strange piece in verse 13. One of the elders. If it's one of the elders, that's one who's been there for some time, but he asked the question. You'd probably have to say this has got to be a rhetorical question, wouldn't you? Since he's been there, he knows the answer. John knows that he knows the answer, and he says so. He says, well, you know what the answer is. But he asked John, the identity of the great company, to focus attention on their essential nature. And then in verse 14, that's where we get the key to who this is. These are those who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore, in view of the great loss of life during this time period, through martyrdom, this is mostly their escape. If you think about it, martyrdom is their escape. So now we started the tribulation period. Things are getting pretty tough. We're starting to see those who stand for their faith being martyred. Now, here's the question. This says in the Great Tribulation. So the question is, does this happen later? Does this happen? Are we looking at those martyred throughout the entire tribulation? If so, it would not be in sequence with everything else we've done, because that's not going to come until the end of tribulation. So let's spend a little time on the sequence of the book and on the question of tribulation. There are actually three different mentions of types of tribulation, I guess I should call it that way, in the book, and they are first in Christian life. There's tribulation in Christian life. Now, we have to put ourselves in the position of John. Remember always, one of the first things of biblical study of hermeneutics is put yourself in the position of the audience being told to or talked to by the writer. So we have to go back to John and who he's writing to. And in John's time, we already had tribulation. You might even call it great tribulation, because we know what's happened to some of the believers. And 1 Peter probably does the best job of telling us what's going on. If you went back to 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 16, here's what you're going to find. Dear friends, now first of all, Peter's writing to believers, and he's writing to believers, by the way, and he tells you in Cappadocia and Bithynia, some of the same areas that we talk about with our 7 churches. That's who he's writing to. It's a circular letter that's going to go to all of them. Here's what he says. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the painful trial you are suffering, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice that you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be approved when His glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. If you suffer, it should be as a murder. It should be as a murderer or a thief or any other kind of criminal, or even as a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear his name. How many times do you hear me say the word suffer? That same word can be rendered tribulation. Well, there was at least 4 times I said the word suffer, and we know what repetition means in the Bible. So the point is that the first type of tribulation we have was in John's lifetime, John's period on earth, that happened beginning with Nero and ending with Domitian. It's Domitian who tries to, at least according to church history, tries to boil John in oil. Not successful. That's why he ends up on Patmos. Well, we see the beginning of this tribulation as early as, and if you go back and read chapter 7 of Acts, it's going to say that Stephen, when he's stoned, after he's stoned, a great persecution breaks out. A great tribulation breaks out. So from that point on, through at least 95 AD, we have this first type of tribulation, which is the tribulation of a Christian life on earth. Now, the second type is a little more intense, and it's talked about in Daniel 12. And you'll recall we've said Daniel 12 is another one of those links we should do. It's predicted in Daniel 12, and he says this, such as you'll see an intensity such as not has been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, nor shall ever see again. That's the second type of tribulation. The third is called the Great Tribulation. Now, they've used the terminology here, Great Tribulation. It could mean they're talking about the very end of tribulation, or it may just be that they're describing how difficult the tribulation was. The Great Tribulation is inflicted during the period of the trumpets in chapter 8 and the bowls of chapter 16. So let's go look at... let's go look at the possibilities here. The tribulation that's being talked about here, that we've seen the great saints, or the great multitudes come through, I think it could be at least 2 different locations. The first is the first 3.5 years. After the first 3.5 years, everything else points to the fact, or it could be the last 3.5 years from chapters 14 through 19. Could be in that period of time, but everything we have here so far points to it being one of the earlier tribulations. In other words, those who come out of the tribulation that has happened as a result of the 144,000 spreading the word of the gospel. I think it's an early group of those who will come out of tribulation. I think we're going to see one more period of tribulation that's going to be even more intense. So the question then, are these the one who die in tribulation or the great tribulation? Because that kind of indicates the question of, is the book chronological or sequential or not? If it's not sequential, these could be the ones from the great tribulation. That's why I believe it is sequential, and they are the ones from the early tribulation. So let me ask you this. And here's your question, Ernie. This is part of the, I told you there's a quiz today. When is the final moment that believers can be saved in this period of time?
I think at the end.
Well, I will tell you, I don't know. But let me tell you what I did find. I think Ernie's answer was at the very end. I think that's a true answer. But let me get you to where at least we see the last of those mentioned that are saved. And it's all the way back in chapter 18. If you get to chapter 18, when we get to chapter 18, we get to the fall of Babylon. Chapter 19, chapter 18 and 19, we get to the fall of Babylon and the great battle. And who wins the great battle? We'll get in chapter 19. I think it starts in verse 6 when Jesus rides in on his white steed. But let me tell you what happens in chapter 18 and the fall of Babylon. In chapter 18, we're going to do verse 4 and 5. Then I heard another voice from heaven say, come out of her, my people, in other words, Babylon, so that you will not share in their sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. So come out and come up here tells us that there are believers, there have been believers, converts, from the time of tribulation up to at least this point. That's the last citation I can find where it says anything in the book about those who are believers. So at the very outside, we can say we have believers all the way up until the time of the fall of Babylon just before the Great War. I think Ernie's got the right answer. I think any time up to the point that the Lord appears, anyone in Great Tribulation will be saved. Again, we talked last week a little bit about John Hagee's movies and the books on what happens in this period of time. And I think the movies at least do a pretty good job of showing those who after the rapture. Now, John Hagee's probably going to say the rapture occurs pre-tribulation, if not mid-tribulation. But his point is he shows who's left behind. And that's the name of the series, right? Left Behind. And the effects it has on the left behind. He shows two different views. One of those who say, oh, that's just a natural catastrophe that just happens on. And you're going to see the other ones that he shows that go, whoa. I just saw my wife and my daughter disappear before my very eyes. There had to be something going on. I think one of the greatest periods of conversion is going to be after the rapture, whether that occurs early or mid part. Let's get back to our reading, though.
Did you know, you brought up John Hagee, did you know that he teaches that Jews don't need Jesus to be saved? I mean, that's heresy.
I won't disagree with that. There's a lot of things I don't agree with on John Hagee. You'll be surprised at this. There's a lot of things that I don't agree with on a lot of pastors.
I mean, that's just really bad teaching, right? I mean, he says that Jews are already saved through the first covenant, that they don't need Christ.
Well, I don't know that much about John Hagee. I would tell anybody that said you don't need Christ that you're on the wrong path.
Yeah.
Now, wash their robes in the blood of the Lamb. Most likely implies martyrdom, but it also refers to forgiveness of sins through faith in Christ and his shed blood. And then in verse 15, the great multitude. Notice what the great multitude do. They'll serve the Lamb day and night. The 144,000, by the way, are later described as the ones who follow the Lambs wherever he goes. And to serve indicates a priestly service before the Lord. The priesthood of Christians will enter a new phase in the presence of God in heaven. Now, last night a question came up. Actually, the question was mine, but we had a little discussion about it. Did you ever wonder what happens? Well, first of all, how long is eternity? Pretty long, huh? Yeah, I think a while. I think that's right, Ernie. It's going to be a while, some period of time. Do you ever wonder what we're going to do for eternity?
A lot of praise.
Well, we will, but I'm holding out for each morning you'll get up and there'll be a list of activities, and one of the activities is Paul is going to be lecturing on what in the world happened on the road to Damascus and the Great Hall somewhere. That's what I'm hoping for. So to try to get your mind around eternity, for me, is difficult because it's just hard to imagine what happens for eternity. I mean, I'm one of those guys who gets up every day and does a list of things that have to get done for that day. What do I do for eternity? So that's a bit of an aside. Verses 16 and 17. He will shepherd them and lead them to living fountains of water. You get a recollection here of Psalm 23. Do you remember in Psalm 23, the Lord who is the shepherd? In Psalm 23 is equated here with the Lamb. Both King David, and the great multitude will dwell in the house of the Lord, which we get from Psalm 23 with Christ for this eternity. Start to say for this eternity, however long it is. The living water explains why there's no thirst. And then I want to hit one more phrase, and that is this one. God will wipe away every tear. There are no crying, no sorrow, no pain. We're going to see that again, aren't we? Go to chapter 21 of Revelation, and that's exactly what it says. There'll be no more crying, no more pain, no more tears. The old things have passed away. Interesting enough, both of them are quoting Isaiah. They're quoting prophecy from Isaiah of what's going to happen when the servant comes, one of the servant psalms. Now we finished this interlude that we talked about. We've finished this period of time that we've talked about, and we're going to have the period of silence, and then then we're going to be introduced to the 7 trumpets in chapter 8. So turn with me to chapter 8, and in the meantime, let me deal with, actually I'll do it a little further down. I want to deal with this question of, is the book sequential? In other words, from the time John starts, is everything sequential happening after that, up to the point that we get to the new earth, the new heavens, new earth. There are some who believe it is not sequential, is not chronological. I don't think you can make a very good case for that, and I'm going to make the case for why I believe it is. Probably, again, it's one of those questions is how many angels can dance on the head of the pen? It doesn't really make a whole lot of difference, but there are discussions about it that you need to know about. So we'll come back to it here in just a minute. Now, here in chapter 8, we need to focus on 2 things. The last seal of the scroll, which we're going to get, and then the beginning of trumpets. So the first few verses are going to deal with the last seal, and then we're going to get to the beginning of the 7 trumpets. So it's not that long. Let me read, let's break this into 2 pieces. Let's just read the last seal first, and then we'll deal with the trumpets. When he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in the heavens for about half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. Another angel who had golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of the saints, went up before God from the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and hurled it on the earth. And there came peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Wow, pretty spectacular ending to what was a relatively quiet period of time, wasn't it? So the 7th seal is opened on the scroll, finally allowing it to be unrolled. What's interesting about this to me is we are never told what's in the scroll. It never says, now that we can open the scroll, what's in it? It's not given to us in the writings, but it's pretty easy to understand that what's written on there is everything we're going to see from this point on. That's what is likely in the 7 sealed scroll. Boy, say that fast for a minute. And then we get the silence for a half hour. What's the purpose of silence for a half hour?
I heard it was hearing the prayers of the...
I think that's an excellent idea. The reality is we aren't really told. There's a couple of things that could be, but I think you're on the right path. I think it's to hear the prayers. It seems to mark a brief but significant break between the unsealing of the scroll and the trumpet judgments. And we're going to see the same thing when we get to the bowls. We're going to see a break that does the same thing. So it's a significant stop to say, hold on, you're getting ready to see something much more intense, I guess is the best way to say it. So the silence is broken only by heavenly offerings and, Eileen, the prayer of all the saints. Now, John's view may also be that heaven is not quieted to hear the praise of the saints, but to hear the cries of deliverance and justice from God's persecuted saints. Either way, it's going to be prayers, right? It is a pretty eerie silence when you think about it before the storm, as all of heaven awaits the coming judgment. Now, here is our 7th seal and the beginning of the trumpets. Here are our trumpets, and I want to go back and forth between these two for just a second, so you'll have to kind of keep up with going back and forth between the two. When we get to the 7 trumpets, and that's going to be about 4 chapters, from chapter 8 through chapter 11, you'll see intensifying judgment on the earth. There's going to be another interlude before the last trumpet, which we'll see here in just a minute, just as there was between the sixth and seventh seal and with the 144,000. The interlude of chapter 10 and 11 is the little scroll and the two witnesses. We'll look at that here in a few minutes as well. But let me show you something that I think gives us a pretty good indication of why I believe the book to be sequential and intensifying as we go. Let's look first at the seven trumpets. You'll notice, let's go to the second trumpet. 1/3 of the sea becomes blood. 1/3 of the ships and sea life are destroyed. Look at the third trumpet. 1/3 of the waters turn bitter. Now, let's spring forward to the seven bowls. Look at the second bowl. Sea turns to blood. All sea creatures died. What happened with the trumpets? It was a third. You get to the bowls, it's the entire sea. It's all creatures. Look at what happens in the third bowl. Rivers turn to blood. All rivers turn to blood. If we go back and look at what happens with the trumpets, we see 1/3 of the waters turn bitter. The point to all of this is everything we're seeing intensifies. We wouldn't have this happen. We wouldn't have the trumpet judgments happen and then somehow go back, or the bowl judgments happen, and then go back to the trumpet judgments. That's why I believe the book is sequential and chronological. Each one kind of piles on top of the other. Now let's look at two other slides and then we'll move on.
So we're gonna talk about what they are?
Oh yeah. Yep. Oh yeah. Yep. We'll do that here in just a minute. I just wanted to make the point that things are intensifying. We went from the seals, not a lot happening there. In fact, most of what happens with the seals is it just talks about what's going to happen in the future. Now we're going to get to the trumpets, and we're going to see the devastation that happens with the trumpets. And just before the major battle, we're going to see in the bowls, we're going to see a whole bunch of what's going to happen on earth. And that's why I don't want to be here for when it happens. Now, let's look at our outline of chapters here for a minute. We've just left chapter 7, and you'll notice the block of chapter 8, 9, 10, and 11. That's going to be the block we're talking about. The introduction of the trumpets and the seventh seal opened. You'll notice something in chapter 8. We're going to get 4 of the trumpets. Chapter 9, we're going to get 2 more trumpets. 4 and 2 is... Boy, this is up. 4 and 2 is 7.
6.
That's
4 and 2 is... All right, 4 and 2 is 6. Where's the seventh trumpet? We're going to get to that until chapter 11. Do you remember how we had the interlude between the seals? Now we're going to have the interlude when we get between the seals and the trumpets. Now we're going to have the interlude in chapter 10 once again between the trumpets and the bowls. And that interlude is designed for the reader to say, there's something coming that's going to be spectacular, and there is. Now, let's look at one more slide. And that's going to be our 7 trumpets. I want you to notice that in the 7 trumpets, everything that happens in Revelation 8 all the way up through Revelation 9. Look at the 6th trumpet, Revelation 9. And then all of a sudden we get to the 7th trumpet in Revelation 11. Well, what happened to chapter 10? That's where our interlude's going to be.
Say it again.
In chapter 10, that's where our interlude is going to be. Just like we had our interlude with the seals, now we're going to have the interlude with the trumpets. And in that interlude is going to be a pause. And we're going to learn about a couple things there. We're going to learn about the two witnesses, the tribulation witnesses, and the 1,200, what are called the 1,260 days, or the 42 months, the first half of tribulation. That's going to be in chapter 11. But in chapter 10, we're going to see the mighty angel with the little book and 7 thunders. That's going to be the interlude. And then we'll get to the last trumpet. Does that make sense? So you can see the pattern developing here. There's 2 patterns. One is this interlude that's going to announce the next major thing in each one of them. That's one. The other is this intensification. We've gone from a third of the seas to all the seas. Well, what's happening in that same period of time? By the way, it's not just what happens to man in these things, but it's what man's reaction to those things are going to be that adds to it. Think about this for just a minute. If all the rivers are dried up, or if all the rivers are made non-potable, what's going to happen on earth between men? You don't think there's going to be some... We have fighting today over water in the West, don't we? You don't think there's going to be the same kind of thing happen in that period of time? So let's go back and kind of dissect this. In verse 2, chapter 8, verse 2, the judgments of the 7 trumpets unfold in a pattern very similar, as we've talked about, to what we've seen before, and is going to develop again in the bowls of wrath which follow. That's why I believe it's sequential, and we can see the intensification happen. The wrath of God intensifies from the seals to the trumpets to the bowls of wrath. In verses 2 through 6, the angels who stand before God, many believe, the 7 angels, it's the same 7 angels from the churches that we saw earlier, the 7 angels of the churches. Now, there's nothing here that tells us that, but the indications are it's similar to the same angels we had in the churches. And recall, the term angelos is simply messenger. In both Hebrew and Greek, it simply means messenger. So the belief here is it's the same 7 angels. In breaking the silence in heaven, in verse 1, the prayers of God's people for God to act in judgment are heard and responded to with noises, thunder, lightning, and earthquakes. Very common to describe, especially in the Old Testament, you see all of those used to describe what? Yahweh, to describe God. So that's his response. And then in verses 7 through 12, we're going to get this. As in the sequence of the first 4 seals, the angels sound the first 4 trumpets in rapid succession. But the effects of the trumpet judgments on earth are far more devastating than the seals. Listen to what happens here. And let me get back to our slide of the day, which is going to be... There we go. I want you to notice something. Slide 15. Notice this. A third of all the trees and grass, a third of the sea, the living creatures in the sea and the ships on the sea, a third of all rivers and springs of water, and then apparently a third of all daylight and moonlight are affected by the trumpet judgments. Did you notice something here? Look at the first 4. All of them are going to deal with something happening in our environment. So far, we're not to the point where anything's happening with mankind. All of those are going to deal with what's happening in our environment. But the effects of what happens in the environment are going to be felt on earth. And we're going to see what happens with some of those things happening. So the first 4 judgments seem designed, if you think about it, almost to reverse in part the original creation. If we go back and read Genesis, what are we going to deal with? We're going to deal with the earth. We're going to deal with the trees. The first things we're going to deal with is the building of our environment. We don't get to mankind until chapter 3, 2, I guess it is. So it's almost as if I'm reversing everything I built here before. So the Lord initially assaults the environment. Food is destroyed. Distribution of goods is crippled. Water supply is severely limited. And production is cut drastically. So now we have kind of the overview of these first few verses. So when the first angel sounds the trumpet, a storm of hail, fire, and blood breaks forth. We're going to see all 4 of these, we're going to see a relationship between Exodus. Do you remember in Exodus, one of the plagues was hail and fire? I cannot tell you what the addition of blood means. I have not been able to find it. Let me tell you where we are here. Oh, actually, I need to go back and read that. Let's read verses 6 through the end of the chapter, and it'll make a little more sense. Then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down upon the earth. A third of the earth was burned up. A third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky, and on the third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star was Wormwood. A third of the water turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. As I watched, I heard the eagle that was flying in midair call out in a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blast about to be sounded by the other three angels." So far in chapter 8, we've only dealt with the first four trumpets. So let's go back to what the first four trumpets portend for us. As I said in verse 7, first angel sounds his trumpet. We get hail and fire. We're going to get that, if we go all the way back to Exodus, we're going to find that as one of the plagues, hail and fire. What I can't tell you is why the addition of blood here.
Why the addition of what?
Why the addition of blood? You'll notice, Ernie, it says, look at verse 7. Then the first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood.
I think it could be contaminated water.
Possible.
Water. I mean, that turns it red like blood.
We'll see that later as well. That's possible. There's only two theories I've been able to find that anybody came up with, and the first is it's the blood of the martyrs. The second is it's not that it comes with it, it's the consequence of the hail and the fire. That's probably more likely. Surprisingly, I can't find any of the commentary. Maybe I should write a commentary. In fact, we'll call it the Book of Tom. There's nothing really that addresses the blood. What it does address is what happens in the Exodus and the plagues, and you're going to see that occur a little bit more. Ernie, question?
No, I think, talking about, I see the first one being volcanic eruptions, like in the ring of fire that existed from the earth. That could very well be the case.
We're going to see the eruption here in just a second, actually. So let's go on to the others in verses 2 through 6. Oops, sorry, already did that. In verses 8 and 9, second trumpet, a great mountain burning. That's a little bit more like what you would think of as a volcanic eruption, wouldn't you? That suggests a massive island volcano erupting, exploding explosively over far-flung sections of the ocean. The description of the effects on the sea, however, indicates that this is much more than wind-blown pollution from volcanic ash. The sea becoming blood and the creatures in the sea dying are like an extension of the first plague in the Egyptians, the turning of the waters of the Nile into blood. Do you remember what occurred there? Now, I do have to tell you that if you picture this, and the best picture I ever had in my mind about this event was, do you remember a couple of years ago? Oh, no, it's been, Deborah would say, Tom, it's 20 years ago. So some time ago, I can tell you this, there was one of the most violent eruptions of a volcano that we've had in quite some time. It was in either Iceland or Greenland. I don't remember, Reykjavik. Do you remember that? The name of the volcano is about this long, so I can't even tell you what it was, but I can tell you that there was a photo that was taken from above, from an airplane someplace that showed it, and it did two things for me. One, it gave me a chance to visualize what I think the Shekinah glory is, because in the middle of this volcano was this huge pillar of bright, bright, bright orangish red fire. And then above it, in every direction that you could see for miles and miles and miles, was the smoke that occurred from it. Some of you might recall, if you were here for either the 416 fire or the Missionary Ridge fire, what happened every morning when you got up? You went out and your car had a film of dust or ash on it, didn't it? So when I envision this, that's the kind of thing that I envision. So what's naturally going to happen in all of this? You're going to see, and I think even, what's the creek that comes down to your pond?
Hermosa Creek?
Trip Creek. Well, Trip Creek or Hermosa Creek.
Yeah.
Did you not see all kinds of ash and stuff like that in that creek? You couldn't, if you had wanted to, you couldn't have drunk out of that creek, right? That's what's being displayed here, but it's being done over a third of all the earth. Do you get the implications?
Is there gonna be global warming then? as a result?
Well, we are almost
Just a little early on it. aren't we?
we're almost to the trumpet that's been known as the Al Gore trumpet. Sorry, Ernie. But there is a good point about that. The other thing that tends to happen, and in fact, if you go back and look at Krakatoa and some of the others, many believe that some of the early ice ages were a result of what you might think of as an atomic winter. There's so much cloud cover that the Earth freezes. So that's not a bad point. That's going to be the Al Gore trumpet. Let's go on to the third trumpet, the star. Here it translates the same term used for the angelic star, but the precise meaning we need to look at is from heaven to earth, burning like a torch as it enters the atmosphere. Now, the star could fall on a third of the rivers and springs and disintegrate as it passes through the earth. In other words, most people believe, we've had comets and we've had other heavenly bodies penetrate our atmosphere. What typically happens to them? They burn up or they scatter, they divide. If you didn't have the proper point of entry of a spacecraft coming exactly where it should be, you know what would happen to it? It'd splinter into thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces. So the point here is the star could fall on a third of the rivers and springs by disintegrating as it passes through the atmosphere. It's also possible that the pollution of the headwaters of a number of the world's major rivers are going to be affected. At any rate, we see that in verse 10. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star blazing like a torch fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of the water. And we just got through making a case for what happens in that case. If a third of all potable water in the world is all of a sudden lost, not only is there going to be the people affected directly by it, but don't you think there's going to be other effects? Don't you think there's going to be some fights, some battles, some wars over where's water? So you begin to see that as these things intensify, it's not just what God is doing, it's what mankind is doing on the earth to help destroy himself. Let's move on to, by the way, the term wormwood here. It's a plant found in the Middle East. It's known for its bitter taste. Interestingly, it's not poisonous. So if you drank the water, you probably wouldn't get poisoned, but it's so bitter that you are unable to drink the water. That's why it's assigned this name, wormwood. And many men die from the water. The rapid pollution of a third of the world's drinking water would set off a chaotic crisis. So look at verse 11 again. It doesn't just say, here's what happens. The name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that have become bitter. Not just from the waters, but from the effects of what happens with it. The fourth trumpet is reference to the darkening of the sun, moon, and stars. We've talked about chapter 24 of Matthew before, and we know, in fact, I'm not even going to read it. We know that in chapter 24, the Lord says, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not show light anymore. He's telling exactly what's going to happen here. A reference to the darkening of the sun, moon, and stars, reminiscent also of the ninth plague. If we go back to Exodus, in the ninth plague, what happens? Everything is turned to darkness. So there's, in all four of these, there is a connection. Boy, I wish we had the Bible rainbow and we could pick it apart. We might go see all these connections happening. So it's the ninth plague and the heavenly disturbance involving Christ's description that he had during the Olivet Discourse. It's also similar to the phenomenon of the sixth seal, where we saw a third of the day did not shine. Now, there's a couple ways to look at this. It could mean that the sun, moon, and stars will not be seen for several hours of the normal cycle of the day. More likely would be this. What has happened so far is we've seen all these things happen, and we just got through talking about this volcanic ash, and if this that big a volcanic reaction, the volcanic ash has got to be almost worldwide, what would happen as a result? Intensity of the sun, right? If you went out and tried to look at the sun, by the way, did anybody know there was a solar eclipse over the weekend? I didn't either. I read it in the Herald, which sometimes has news. There was a solar, and it was visible here. It was either Saturday or Friday. I don't remember which one it was. Not much hubbub about it.
Partial or?
No, it's total. I think it was total, Ernie. I can't swear to that, but it's not going to happen again for 27 years. The point is, if you were to evidence a solar eclipse, or even if you were to evidence a very cloudy day, what happens? Intensity of the sun isn't anywhere near what it normally would be. So picture, if you would, the ash in the sky, and we saw a little bit of that happen during the fires as well. As the plumes would blow up, we'd see things get darker and darker and darker. So it's either going to be that the sun, moon, and stars are not going to shine for a period of time, or their intensity of the light is not going to be anywhere near what it should be. Once again, what is going to be the effect of that? Pretty close to what we talked about earlier in terms of what many people call an atomic winter, where the mushroom cloud occurs and is there for some time, and as a result, things cool on the earth radically. Then we get to verse 13, and we're going to end there, because I want you to notice something here. In verse 13, woe, woe, woe. What's repetition mean?
It's important.
It's important, and it's done for emphasis. One woe is pretty bad. Two woes would be something. Three woes is whoa. So, but it's also, in this case, it's going to lead us to chapter 9, and it's going to be the impact of the three remaining trumpets, the judgments on unbelieving inhabitants of the earth. The woes are actually taking us into the next chapter. So far, we've only dealt with 4 of these, and all 4 of them have dealt with what's going on in the environment. The last 3 of them are going to deal with what's happening to man. So the first woe is the first trumpet. The second woe is the 6th trumpet. The third woe is said to be coming quickly, and it may be either the 7th trumpet, although it's not stated. If not, the final woe may be focused on Babylon, the great harlot. So that's what happens in at least for the first 4 trumpets. Have you seen the severity that we're talking about now? Wait until we get to the bowls of judgment. Yeah, I know you.
Is this after the rapture?
Well, it depends.
Where do you land on it?
Well, that's exactly right. It is going to be one of 2 places, and that's a good way to end this. You'll notice that, at least according to whoever put this chart together, they have the rapture occurring before the tribulation begins at all.
Right.
That's pre-tribulational. The other alternatives are you see where mid-tribulation is? Halfway between the 2 red boxes. There's also a third case. I think it's a harder one to make, and that is that the rapture is not going to occur until Christ's second coming, which is going to be at the end of the tribulation period. I believe under any circumstance, any of those who bend the knee to the Lord Jesus Christ and say, "You are my Savior," I think they're going to be protected just as the 144,000 were. So you can take your pick on which one of these they are, but if we are not yet to chapter 11, Keith, I would make the point that all of this is in the early stages, the first part, the first 3.5 years of tribulation. That's why we haven't seen as radical an effect on things as we will in the bowls of judgment.
Because the first trumpet, unrelated to the timeline, the first trumpet says 1/3 of the earth was burned up. So in theory, 1/3 of the people will die. In theory, burned up. Right? So it's just interesting because as you go through these trumpets, a lot of people are dying.
Oh, yeah.
Like 1/3, I would think 1/3 of humans on the earth would die from the first trumpet.
Well, we certainly get to that point when we get to the end of the trumpets, because so far all it's really told us about is what's happening and the effects on physical earth. Do people? It's possible, but we certainly are going to see that in the last 3 trumpets, right? So now let's assume that, and I think your point's a good one, let's assume that, but at least by the time we get through the trumpets, a third of the world's population is gone. You know how many people are in the world right now? 8 billion. So if a third of those are gone, and that's why I keep thinking during this period of time, aren't people going to be looking around saying, man, there might be something to what these Christian people think?
You would think, but
You would think.
their hearts are.
Yep.
So,
Lynn?
1 Corinthians 4:16, for the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of your basis for pre-trib.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. That's probably you're right, Lynn, that's kind of the seminal verse for where that concept comes from.
I mean, the first trumpet alone is it's gonna make any other natural disaster we've seen seem like child's play.
I agree.
Right.
Yep. So Keith's point was, even the first trumpet, take the rest of them away. The first trumpet is going to be unlike anything we've ever seen before. We think the fires were a big deal here? Not going to be.
Right now, like weather events or events that happen are very isolated. You know, none of us were affected by the tsunami in Sri Lanka 15 years ago, or whatever. Things are very isolated. The earthquake or the volcano and ice.
Right.
That's a third of the earth.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I heard on the radio on the way down here today that Florida had 20 inches fall in 24 hours. 20 inches of rainfall in 24 hours. How does that affect us? We got a little sprinkle last night, but what if that happened throughout the world? What if we had 20 inches in 24 hours here? Do you know what the effects would be? Well, first of all, 250 would be closed permanently. We'd probably have rocks coming off Highway 3.
Lake Powell may be back to its normal level.
That's true. Ernie?
See, so, I see the first trumpet being like a major volcanic, like around the ring of fire. The second trumpet, I see it as a, maybe perhaps, and this is again conjecture, but like an asteroid
Mm-hmm.
that would come, or a meteor. In the case number 2 would be a meteor. Number 3 would be like a asteroid itself that would create such a big tsunami when you're talking about it would just be overwhelming. So,
Ernie, I would probably put it this way. Look at verse 7. The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood. That's a lot more reminiscent of what we saw happen at Sodom and Gomorrah. That is actual hail descending. The second trumpet, I would probably say, is much more like the volcano you're describing when it says a huge mountain. And then the third trumpet, the great star, the asteroid or whatever is going to penetrate the earth. Any way you look at it, Keith has a great point. Look at the very first one. If a third of the earth is affected, that's unlike anything we've ever seen before. Now, what we don't know is geographically, is it a portion of the third, or is the third spread around? And I don't know that it's consequential. The point is, look what's happening.
How long was the time frame between the first and second trumpet?
We aren't told. What we are told,
What did Tom say?
the book of Tom says 4 days and 27 minutes.
Where's the 27 minutes?
Because it's 3 times 3 times 3.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. Here's what we can tell, Keith. Depending on how our view here, we know that all of these have to happen in the first 3.5 years, right? If that's true, until we get at least to the bowls. So if this is accurate, if our timeline is accurate, the tribulation, all of these happen within the 3.5 years. I believe they are probably relatively close to each other, and then the effects are felt until we get to the rest of it. So I'm going to say they are sequential, and they probably happen relatively close. I don't know if anybody's ever even hazarded a guess, besides me, on, what I say, 4 days, whatever it was. Yeah, I don't know that anybody's ever hazarded a guess on when these occur, other than that they are in short order, and they have to fit within at least a 7-year period, or our whole theory of tribulation is wrong. More likely, I think they fit within the first 3.5 years.
where does World War III
Pardon?
play into this? Where does World War III play into this?
We'll get to, it's not going to be called World War III, but we'll get to something very similar to that when we get to chapter 18 and 19.
Well, the sixth trumpet that you have on your chart there, too.
Yeah, Ernie's point is when we get to the sixth trumpet, will there be wars? Well, the Lord says there'll be wars and rumors of wars. Whether it'll be World War III or not, or local skirmishes, I can't tell you. Well, you guys ask a lot of weird questions. Now you know why I was able to get through the lesson by myself so much easier. But actually, they're great questions, and don't stop asking them. So let's stop there for today. Come back. And by the way, in chapter 9, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on chapters and verses again and where they come from. Because if you notice, chapter 9 is logically flows from chapter 8. You can't find a chapter break there that makes any sense, so why would anybody do it there? We'll spend some time with that next week. So let's call it a day and come back next week and deal with chapter